Hi, welcome to Hometime. I'm Dean Johnson.
And I'm Robin Hartl. In this videotape, we'll show you how we replace the old dated vinyl floor in this kitchen with this new ceramic tile floor. We'll cover removing the old flooring and installing the underlayment of cement tile backer board.
Then we'll go through the steps for laying out the tile and installing it. And finally, we'll show you how to apply and finish the grout between the tiles. Hometime is made possible by Chevy full-size pickup, the most dependable, longest-lasting full-size pickup on the road. At Hometime, we believe the best way to get the job done is to use the finest tools.
And the Chevy Silverado is one of our favorites. Equipped with an optional Vortex 6000 V8 engine, it generates 300 horsepower and 355 foot-pounds of torque to power you through the toughest jobs.
And with an available fourth door, you've got lots of room for all your other tools.
And friends to help you use them.
At home or on the job site.
For work or play.
It's no wonder we at Hometime count on Silverado, the truck, to get the job done.
Silverado from Chevy, the most dependable, longest-lasting trucks on the road.
If you're thinking about installing a ceramic tile floor, you have to understand what goes underneath it and how that's going to affect the final height of the floor.
If you stack up all the elements that you need for a good ceramic tile floor, then you'll end up with something that's a little over an inch thick. You've got the tile, and then the cement backer board underneath that, and then the mortar to set the backer board to the floor and to set the tile. Plus, we ended up putting down a 1/4-inch plywood underneath everything. So you really need to figure out what height your finished floor is going to be and how that's going to affect your doors, any plumbing fixtures or appliances, your wood trim, and where your tile floor meets the other type of flooring.
So the first thing we did for our construction was to pull up the old vinyl floor and the layer of plywood underneath it.
This is a lot of hard work, and it's messy and dangerous. So just be careful and work slowly.
You may find it helps to set a circular saw to cut the depth of the vinyl and the underlayment and use it to cut the flooring up into workable sections. Now, we found it particularly hard to cut down through the flooring right next to the cabinets. So we rented a small power saw called a toe kick saw for this. And we temporarily screwed a piece of 1/4-inch plywood across the front of the cabinet to keep the saw from damaging it.
If you can't find a toe kick saw, you can also use a regular reciprocating saw. This isn't as convenient, and again, you have to be careful not to damage the fronts of the cabinets. You have a couple options for trying to take out old floor tile. The simplest is to beat on it with a fist maul or a sledgehammer. You want to break the tile and bust apart the layer of mortar that you'll find lots of times under professionally installed tile floors. And the mortar will probably have a wire mesh in it for reinforcement. It seems that on almost all the tile jobs we do, we end up putting down an extra layer of plywood. Now, on this job, we put down a layer of 1/4-inch thick plywood over the planks so that we'd have a smooth, even layer to start with. It'll help even out the old subfloor, and it'll keep the adhesive from dripping down between the old planks.
Well, now it's time to work on the underlayment. That's a layer directly underneath the tile. Now, we're going to use cement backer board. It's a great material for do-it-yourselfers. It's available at most home centers, comes in different thicknesses and sizes. Now, we generally work with a 1/2-inch thick. That's 3 feet by 5 feet.
The easiest way to cut backer board is with a hardened scoring tool. You run it along the line you want to cut a couple of times. You have to hold it pretty firmly and push down pretty hard. The tool will be cutting through the fiberglass mesh on the surface of the sheet and scoring down into the mortar core. And it's helpful to have a straight edge or a drywall T-square to guide you. Then you snap the sheet apart on the score mark. After you snap it, the two parts will still be hanging together by the fiberglass mesh on the backside. Use a utility knife to cut through that. Fit the sheets of backer board together, but don't push them together real tight. It's okay to have a tiny space between them. Always line up the long edges of the backer board next to each other. In other words, don't start switching the orientation of the board. The the long edges are rounded a little, just like drywall, to help you fill the joints between them. So you want those edges next to each other.
If you need to cut a round hole in the backerboard, like we did for a bathroom project we worked on, you need to draw the shape of the hole on both sides of the sheet. It helps to drive a nail through the center of the hole so that you can transfer the pattern from one side to the other. Then you score the cut on both sides of the sheet. Finally, gently tap a hammer all the way around the inside of the opening. The piece will eventually break out. You may discover that you need to cut a little off the bottom of your door casing or stops so you can slip the tile under it. We usually measure up the thickness of the backerboard and the tile, and then add another 1/4 of an inch for the 2 layers of mortar. Now you can get a special saw called a jam saw for this, but we found that a short utility saw works pretty well too. Putting the tile under the wood trim will look better than trying to cut the tile around it. You glue backerboard down to the subfloor with special tile setting mortar known as thin set mortar. It's also sometimes called dry set mortar. Thin set has to be mixed up with water or a latex additive. The additive makes the thin set stronger. Sometimes the additives are already in the mortar and you just add the water. Pour the additive into a large bucket and then add some powder. Keep adding powder until you've got the consistency you want. You want it to feel like thick, stiff mud. For most projects, you want to mix it by hand. The best tool to do this is a margin trowel. And when you mix your thin set, don't try to get all the lumps out right away. Instead, let it sit for about 10 minutes. This is called slaking. Slaking gives the moisture time to penetrate the lumps. On big jobs, you might rent a 1/2-inch electric drill and use a special paddle bit to mix the thin set. Run the drill on a slow speed and keep the paddle in the thin set. Don't blend air into the mix. Once the mortar's had a chance to slake, go back and stir it one last time. This will remove those last few lumps. Pour some mortar out onto the subfloor. It takes a little experience to know just how much to start with. You use a special trowel to apply thin set. 2 edges are straight and 2 edges have square notches on them. First, use the straight edges to spread the mortar out all over the surface. Now make sure you get good contact with the subfloor. You may have to slop out some more to fill out the whole area. Then take the notch sides and comb the mortar out into ridges. When you're doing this, hold the trowel at about a 45-degree angle to the floor. Using the notch side leaves the proper amount of mortar on the floor. The pattern of the combing doesn't have to be pretty. Just try to make it even. For most jobs, you'll want a trowel with notches that are a 1/4 inch deep, 1/4 inch wide, and spaced a 1/4 inch apart. As you comb the mortar off, you may find you'll need a little bit more, or you may find that you've got too much, and you'll end up scraping some off your trowel back into the bucket. When the area is finished, lay the board on top of it. This flattens out the ridges, and the mortar becomes almost a smooth, even layer. Finally, nail or screw the backerboard to the wood subfloor. Now, if you screw, use 1 1/4 inch galvanized screws that are specifically designed for backerboard. If you nail, use 1.5 inch hot-dip galvanized roofing nails. Put the fasteners every 8 inches along the edges. Also put them every 8 inches across the middle of the sheet in both directions.
You can see that we laid out and cut all the sheets of backerboard before we mixed up any mortar. If you're cutting, fitting, mixing up mortar, and attaching the sheets all at the same time, you have to keep moving pretty quickly, or you might end up with some of your mortar hardening up in your bucket before you've had a chance to use it all. The final step for installing backerboard is to mud and tape the joints. Use a 6-inch drywall taping knife to force some thin set mortar into the gap between the sheets. Then take 2-inch wide fiberglass tape and stick it into the mortar. Use mesh tape that's made for backerboard, not the fiberglass tape that's made for drywall. Finally, use the taping knife to spread the mortar out smooth and embed the tape into the mud. Once you're all done with the mudding and taping, then you want to let everything cure for at least a day.
While determining the layout, I think can be probably one of the trickiest things for do-it-yourselfers. Now, it doesn't have to be that confusing if you remember two basic goals. First of all, you want to have straight and square lines in which to lay your tile to, so you don't have grout lines that kind of curve like this up and down the room. Now, the second thing is to determine the arrangement that's going to look best in the room. I think maybe a good way to explain that is using these floor plans. Now, what I've got here is the scale plan of a typical kitchen. We have cabinets around the perimeter, peninsula cabinets, and then two entrances into the space. Now, this represents our grid of 12 by 12 tiles. Now, the challenge is to get these tiles to fit in the space in the most attractive way possible. Now, a good rule of thumb is to place full tiles in some of the most obvious areas, like in an entrance. So let's place full tiles right up against this doorway. Now what we want to do is go to the opposite side of the room and see what that does to our tile cuts over here. We want to avoid real thin pieces of tile. These are about a third of the width of the tile. These are about a third, so that looks pretty good. Now that's east and west. We want to do the same thing north and south. Again, an entrance here, so let's put full tiles right up against that area. Come down to the other side. How are these tiles looking? Again, fairly thick. Those are thick. Now these are relatively thin along this cabinet, but at the same time, they are going to be underneath the toe space here, and more than likely in a space like this, there probably would be a table, so they wouldn't be real noticeable past that table. So I think this is probably a pretty good position for the tile in this space. I mean, I think you get the idea. It's just a big balancing act in how you position these tiles so they look the best in any given space. Now, this is a great way to explain it in theory, but not the way you want to handle it in actual practice. For that, you need a tape measure, some tiles in the actual space. Now, we just want to experiment a little bit. First of all, we want to determine the space between the tiles. In other words, how thick our grout line is going to be. Now, for this size tile, we could go with a 1/4 inch grout space, but I think 2/16 might look just a little bit nicer. So I'm going to start by just getting the measurement of 4 of these tiles with that spacing. Well, once you've come up with the spacing you like, it's helpful to draw up a spacing chart. Our tiles are 11 3/4 inches square. So one tile plus 1 3/16 inch grout joint equals 11 15/16. 2 tiles plus 2 grout joints equals 23 7/8. And then 3 tiles is 35 13/16, and so on, up to about 10 tiles. To start figuring the layout, I've decided that the opening into the living room is the most visible edge for the tile. So I'll work from there and see what happens. Leaving room at the edge of the carpet for a synthetic marble threshold, I lay out 2 runs of tile into the center of the room. Then I use the marks I made at the ends of the 2 rows of the tile to snap a chalk line all the way up and down the room. Now, because I'm working by myself today, I have to use a small nail to nail down one end of the line. The chalk line represents a grout joint. I'll be able to use it to see how the pattern works out in different areas. I work from the chalk line toward the other edges of the flooring that are parallel to the opening into the living room. Now, for instance, first I work towards the wall opposite the opening. I use the chalk line, my spacing chart, and the tape measure to figure out where the last full tile will be. Then I look to see what sort of cut tile I have against the wall. With this layout, I'll end up having pretty large cut tiles. I'll only have to cut a little off of these. So far, so good. However, it looks like I'm going to end up with some pretty tiny cuts under the sink cabinet. Under the opposite run of the cabinets, I'm going to end up with almost full tiles. Or maybe I won't even have to cut them at all. Okay, now looking at the overall layout, I would say really about the only problem we have are the thin tiles underneath that sink. This is a fairly low visibility area. I would say we probably just go with what we've got. I think it'll work good. Now, realize that only covers going this way in the room. Now we have to figure out the layout going this direction. Once again, I've decided that the doorway into the living room is the most visible spot in the layout. I want to center the tile in the opening, and I'll be left with 2 half tiles on either end. Now I mark one of the grout joints and draw a perpendicular line from the mark out into the room using the 3-4-5 technique. I measure 3 feet along the baseline and make a second mark. Then I measure 4 feet out from my first mark and draw a short arc. Now I measure 5 feet out from the second point and mark where the 5-foot dimension intersects the 4-foot arc. Finally, I use a chalk line to connect the very first mark I made with this last mark. The new line will be absolutely perpendicular to the baseline. Now I use this as a reference line and take some measurements and see how this side-to-side layout might work. Okay, now after we took a look at our layout here, it seemed to make sense to move the line a little bit further over in this direction. Had we used our first reference line, we'd just been making too many little cuts in a few different areas. And this is many times what will happen. Your first reference line won't work out. And don't get discouraged by that. I mean, we lucked out on this line, on our tile going this direction, but not on this one. Now, we've shown you a few issues in this kitchen. Let me show you a couple other things you might run into. Well, here's one thing that you might see. Now, let's say you have a room, either side of the room, both visually important. One thing you might want to do is try to center the tile. This is the center line running down that same room. So let's say we place our grid over the top there. We take one of the grout lines and we center that on the space. Unfortunately, we end up with really thin cut tiles on either side. Not a good thing to have. Well, let's try centering one row of tiles in the room. So we'll get that in the middle there. See, that looks a lot better. Here you have wide tiles either side. So probably your best approach to a space like this is look for the design that gives you wide tiles on either edge. Another thing you might run into is a corner of a room, both walls equally visual. Probably your tendency will be to run full tiles along both walls. Well, you'd be surprised how many rooms are perfectly square. So what you'll end up with is full tiles on one side that look great. When you turn the corner, these ugly little angles will start to show up. So your best bet here is to pull the tiles on that side down to a point where you have full tiles on the widest part of that angle. And then as you work into the corner, you'll just take a little bit more off each one of the tiles. Visually, they'll all appear to be large tiles. But with the layout done, now we're going to start snapping some chalk lines and create some work areas that we can now use to start setting the tiles. Now you need to figure out how many tiles you want to work at once. Now generally, you want to work in areas about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. But the exact size, obviously, depends on the size of your tile. I'm going to make boxes that will hold 6 tiles each. All right, well, today I'm going to be setting tile. I'm going to start down on this side of the kitchen and work my way down here. Now, I'll probably only have time to do field tile today. Then I can go back and make all the cuts around the entire room. And I'm going to begin with this little section right in front of me. Now, you set tile with thin set mortar, the same stuff we use to set the backer board. I spread the mortar around with the flat side of the trowel. I comb the mortar out into ridges, holding the trowel at about a 45-degree angle. This trowel has notches that are about 3/8 of an inch deep, which is a good idea when you're setting tiles that are 12 inches square or bigger. Less than 12 inches, and you're probably better off with 1/4 inch deep notches. Okay, I found that I like to comb in from the edges and then either add more or take it away from the center. Now it's time to set the tiles. Now you can push them down pretty hard and give them a little twisting action to smush down the mortar underneath them. Now before you get too far along, you should pry up one of the tiles to check to see how good the adhesion is between the tile and the mortar. Slip your margin trowel under the tile and twist it. Then look at how much of the back of the tile is covered with mortar. It should be sticking to about 90% of the tile. If it's less, then your mortar is probably too dry or you're not putting enough mortar down. If the mortar is covering the whole tile, the mortar might be too wet and won't be as strong as it should be. Now I don't want to set my test tile back, so I add a little more mortar, comb it out, and set down a fresh tile. Now once all the tiles are set, you should spend a couple of seconds getting the spacing just right. Use your layout lines to make sure the tiles are lined up right, and check to see if the tops of the tiles are flush where they meet. Now, you might find that one tile is just a little bit higher or lower than the one next to it, in which case you'll just have to press it down a little. All right, now whenever finished setting an area of tile, and if you have any mortar sticking out through the grout lines, it's a good idea to get that out of there. And the best way to do it is using a pencil. Just run it down the middle here, pull it out, and then discard that, and then using a wet sponge, clean off the top of the tile. Now, if you don't do this, when you grout the floor, you'll end up seeing some different colors in the grout. Okay, now you might wonder why I always start working this corner rather than just coming off the previous square that we were working on. Well, I've determined this is the corner where I will set tiles right up against two chalk lines. Now, the thing you have to realize is that the width of this box, again, represents 3 tiles plus the grout spaces in between those 3 tiles. So this one's on the chalk line, this one's on the chalk line. When I place this third tile, the distance between the chalk line and the edge of the tile is the grout space. Same thing happens on the top. The bottom of this tile is on the line. When I place the second tile here, the distance between that chalk line and the edge of the tile, again, is the grout space. That looks pretty good. I have to tell you, that's a full day's worth of work. Now, I have all the field tiles down that don't get any cuts in them. Now, once these are on the floor, you don't want to walk on them for at least 24 hours. Let them set up at least that long. Well, we let the tile set up for a couple of days. So now it's time to cut some tile. I might notice that I have this blue tape around the perimeter of the tiles that have already set up. This way, once I start setting some of these cut tiles around the perimeter, I'll know exactly where I should walk and what areas I should stay off of. Now, the best tool for cutting the tile is a tile snapper. Now, you can rent one of these for about $9 to $10 a day, or many times the store where you purchase your tile will let you borrow one. So that's one thing you might want to check out with the retailer. Now, the way this machine works is you place a tile on the bed and line the small wheel up with the mark where you want to cut it. Then you push down on the lever and push the scoring wheel across the surface of the tile. And next, you push down on the lever, and this snaps the tile apart along the scored line. And then, I always like to smooth out the cut edge with a tile rub stone. There are a few peculiar things about setting cut tiles. If you've got enough room, you should spread out the mortar on the floor the same way you do for full tiles. But lots of times, there won't be enough room, or there'll be an overhanging cabinet in the way. In that case, you can apply mortar to the back of the tile instead. Now, this is called back buttering. You put it on just like you apply it to the floor. You spread it out and then comb it out into ridges with the notch side of the trowel. When you're putting in your cut tiles, you almost always want to put the cut side toward the outside of your tiled area. In other words, always put uncut edges of tile together. That gives you the best looking joint. The cut outside edges will usually be covered up or hidden. Now, whenever you're measuring for tile, you want to make certain you leave enough space for the grout joint. Make sure to take that into consideration for the measurement. Also leave space between the tile and the wall, about 1/4 inch or so. This will allow space for expansion or contraction due to heat and humidity. Once you get all the tile installed and you put the base back on, it'll cover up that gap anyway. Now, for different types of situations, you'll end up using different types of cuts. For this type of cut, we'll end up using a tub saw. Well, the tub saw has a diamond blade to cut the tile. Plus, it washes the blade with water as it spins. The water washes away the fine dust and keeps the blade from getting hot. A tub saw is about the only way you can cut a nice, straight inside corner piece. But because the blade is round, you'll probably need to use a pair of tile nippers to break out the little extra piece of tile in the corner. I'm also using the tub saw for some long diagonal cuts that are too big for the tile snapper. And for really thin pieces that might be too thin for the tile snapper. Now, whenever you meet up against a different type of flooring material, you want to have a nice, clean transition. Now, there's a couple ways to deal with this depending on the look you're after and the type of material you're going to butt up against. Probably one of the most common ways of handling it is with a threshold. Now, one of the easiest thresholds to work with is a solid surface. Now, many home centers will call this synthetic marble. The same material they use to make kitchen countertops. You install the threshold with thin set, and you'll most likely have to back butter it. Thresholds will often come with one beveled edge, which you put on the edge away from the tile. And you want to pick a threshold that's about the same thickness as the tile. So at the top of the threshold will be flush with the top of the tile. Now, another way to end a tiled area is with metal or plastic edging. Now, home centers are just starting to carry these. Hey, here's how they work. These edge pieces also get installed with thin set. The bottom lip of the piece has perforations in it. And when you install the piece, the thin set squeezes up through these and locks the piece in place. Then you cut and fit your tile over the bottom lip. Now leave a small gap between the tile and the metal edge piece. Grout will go in this gap eventually. Metal trim pieces are also a good option if your tile ends up being part of a staircase. If you install tile as a stair tread, the front edge is hard to support properly, and it can sometimes be damaged by the extra pounding it receives. Metal trim pieces are available that make a strong nosing for the step, and they create a surface with some traction. Now today it's time to do the grouting between the tiles. Now grout is basically nothing more than colored mortar. I mix this up the same way we do the thin set. The main difference is we want to mix this as dry as possible. Now it's mixed, I'll just let it slake a little bit. To get ready for grouting, you want to go over the floor and make sure there's no thin set poking up between the joints. Now hopefully you clean most of this out as you're setting the tiles. Now you want to protect any woodwork or carpeting so it doesn't get stained by the grout. And give the floor a final vacuuming to make sure all the joints are cleaned out. Applying grout takes a special tool called a grout float, a sponge, a bucket of water, a pair of rubber gloves, and a lot of elbow grease. You work in areas that are about 4 feet square. First, you scoop out some grout onto the floor. Then you use the grout float to push it down into the joints. Now, the bottom of the grout float is padded, so you won't end up scratching the surface of the tiles. Now, this is the part of the job where you should work up a sweat. You want to push down pretty hard with the float and really pack the grout into the joints. Holding the float with 2 hands helps. Now, once you've got the area packed, then you work on getting rid of the excess. Now, the first step is to hold the float so that the bottom is almost perpendicular to the floor and scrape the grout off the tops of the tiles. Now, when you do this, make sure that you pull the float diagonally across the joints. If you go parallel to the joints, you'll end up digging some of the grout out. Now, if you go diagonally, you'll scrape down the grout that's in the joints just about even with the surface of the tiles. As you scrape the grout off, you can pile it up in the next area where you're going to work, or put it back in the bucket. Now, the next step is to take a damp sponge and wipe down the surface. Rub the sponge in big circles and keep rinsing it off as it gets clogged up with the grout. And as you're cleaning the surface, you can also use a sponge to shape the grout in the joints. Rub the sponge back and forth a little and smooth the grout out. Now, you want to end up with the grout smoothed down in the middle of the joint, just a little lower than the surface of the tile. Now, the last step, for the moment at any rate, is to wash off the tiles. Now, you take the sponge, rinse it out real well, and then wipe the tile in one smooth, even stroke. Turn the sponge over, use a clean side, to make another stroke next to the first one, and then rinse off the sponge and do it again. Don't make more than one swipe over an area with a sponge without rinsing it out again. Now, once you sponge down an area like this, the tile looks nice and clean. But once that dries, you can see that a little bit of a haze sets up. Now, sometimes you can let this go for a day or so, but I think it works well, especially given the texture of this tile. To wipe it off as soon as possible, you just rub a cloth over the top of it and just pull that haze off the top, being real careful not to step on your grout joints and destroy those. One last step that's needed to protect your tile floor. You want to seal it. Generally, the surface of the tile itself is glazed, which means it's already sealed up pretty well. It won't absorb moisture and stains. But the grout is porous and needs to be sealed. The most common type of sealer is a penetrating silicone sealer. You brush it onto the grout joint and let it soak in. Sealers generally tend to darken the color of the grout a little, although it'll be less obvious once it dries. Most grout sealers say to wait 2 or 3 days after you finish grouting before you seal the grout. Now, you want to give it a chance to completely cure. Now, it's okay if some of the sealer gets onto the tile, as long as you wipe it off before it has a chance to dry. Now, to keep the floor protected, you should probably plan on resealing the grout every year or so. Well, thanks for watching. Now, hopefully this videotape's giving you a real good idea of what's involved in installing a ceramic tile floor.
We hope we've answered most of your questions.